Well, good morning, and welcome to the launch event for the Northern Virginia Champions for Accountability. I am Deb Gandy, Managing Director of Chevy Chase Trust and Vice Chair of the Board of the Northern Virginia Chamber of Commerce, and I'm filling in this morning for Julie Coons, our CEO. We are very excited to present today's program and to debut the Champions for Accountability research findings and digital badging system. This important research has been done in partnership with the Northern Virginia Chamber Foundation and the Community Foundation for Northern Virginia. Today's program is an important dialogue for our region. Diversity, equity, and inclusion and workforce are among our region's biggest challenges, and the Chamber has made workforce and DEI pillars of our strategic priorities. I am especially pleased to be participating in today's program because I have been deeply engaged in recent years with the Chamber's governance review process, which has included an intentional effort to bring more diversity to the Chamber's Board of Directors. I want to emphasize that today's event and the Champions for Accountability project is part of a much larger strategy. Today's project and today's event are just the beginning. We are committed to helping our regional business community grow, learn from one another, and importantly, improve our outcomes. Many people have worked together to create the Champions for Accountability program. First, I want to thank the Community Foundation for Northern Virginia for partnering with the Chamber in this endeavor. I also want to thank our amazing task force of Chief Diversity Officers who shared their advice and expertise to shape this important research. They are Dr. Nathan Carter, Northern Virginia Community College, Layla Sagaro, Periton, Stephanie Turner, MITRE, and Danita Wilson from JBG Smith. We are very grateful for your wise counsel, wisdom, and contributions. You have been instrumental in the success of this project. I also want to thank the Chamber's DEI Board of Advisors, their names are on the screen, and specifically recognize John Allen of Wells Fargo for his leadership as co-chair of the DEI Board of Advisors. And finally, I want to thank MITRE for hosting us today in this very beautiful space and their support in advancing DEI. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Eileen Ellsworth, President and CEO of the Community Foundation for Northern Virginia, and Elizabeth Hughes, Senior Director, Insight Region Center for Community Research, to share key findings from the Champions for Accountability research.
Recently, the Chamber adopted a strategic plan that included a very robust DEI section, which includes the Chamber's goal of helping both member companies and the business community in general in Northern Virginia reflect the diversity of our region. So to help promote those goals and to further the Community Foundation's own mission of advancing equity across our region, we partnered with the Chamber and launched a joint initiative to recognize employers in Northern Virginia who agree to collect, share, and then act upon data about the demographic composition of their leadership, thus taking the first steps towards increasing their organization's diversity. The initiative features the Northern Virginia Champions for Accountability badging program and the production of this report, a copy of which should be on all of your chairs, Championing Diversity in Northern Virginia's Leadership. And my role here today is to share some of the broader findings from that report that were gleaned from the American Community Survey, which, as you know, is part of the Census Bureau, on the overall demographic composition of Northern Virginia's 19,000 executives. And then I'll introduce Elizabeth Hughes, the author of this report and the Senior Director of Insight Region, which is the Center for Community Research at our Community Foundation. And she will then present early results from the badging program. So let's get started by contemplating just this one fact from the American Community Survey that is discussed in the report. Women and people of color together account for just 47% of executives, but constitute 74% of the Northern Virginia workforce. Women of color in particular are very underrepresented in the C-suite and face the steepest odds of ever getting there. The issue is, of course, national in scope, but nevertheless, we can all become more intentional in recruiting, recognizing, and promoting underrepresented talent into the top positions of the companies and institutions we run. So let's take a closer look at these disparities. So this is a modified version of Figure 1 from the report. And Figure 1 shows the demographics of just Northern Virginia's executives and how it has diversified over the past 10 years. So the darker color bars represent the early part of the decade from 2011 to 2016, and the lighter bars represent the later part of the decade from 2016 to 2020. So take a look at the bar graph at the top of this slide, and you'll see that in the early part of the decade, between 2011 and 2016, there were 5,700 executives that were women and people of color. Today, there are 8,900 of them, and that's a 56% increase, which is heartening. And we can also see that earlier in the decade, there were 7,300 executives that self-reported as white men, and today there are 9,900 of them for a 36% increase. 56% increase in representation by women and people of color, 36% increase for white men. And when you disaggregate the gains in that first group, which is what the second bar towards the right is doing, we learn that women of color have made the most gains over the decade from a percentage standpoint, a 73% increase, which is certainly encouraging. However, the numbers were very small to begin with. So even a 73% increase isn't really something to crow about. So to further elucidate this particular weakness in representation in the C-suite, let's take a look at Figure 2 from the report, which compares the demographics of the entire labor force to that of executives, looking for the gaps in representation. And keep in mind, this is all self-reported data from the American Community Survey. So let's start at the top with the two purple lines. And in each of these stats I'm about to quote you really just pertain to the far left of each of these lines. Okay, so the darkest colors on each of these lines. So as the two purple lines demonstrate, 52% of our labor force is comprised of people of color, but only 28% of executives are. Next line, 47% of the labor force is female, but only 29% of executives are. And the bottom line, the blue lines, 24% of the labor force is women of color, but only 10% of executives are. Women of color are the fastest growing group in the C-suite. Recall that their numbers improved by 73% over the decade, but they nevertheless remain grossly underrepresented in the C-suite, constituting only 10% of executives today. Okay, so what do the C-suites in other metro areas across America look like compared to our region for some context? So there are actually two ways of looking at that comparison nationally in the report, but I just wanted to highlight one of them for you. So this is Figure 6 from the report. And here we've applied something called the Ginny Index. And based on that index, and as shown in the highlighted box in Figure 6, just about in the middle of that table, there is a 69% chance in Northern Virginia that a randomly selected worker will identify as a different race or ethnicity than another randomly selected worker, but only a 46% chance that two randomly selected executives will be of a different race or ethnicity, and that is a 23% gap. So when you compare our Ginny Index gap of 23% to the 20 most diverse large metro areas across the country, which is what Figure 6 does, you'll see that our gap in diverse representation between the labor force and the C-suite is just about average among the members of that group. In fact, we rank 10th, with the smallest gap in Riverside, California at 4%, and the largest gap in Virginia Beach at 34%. Okay, so what are the economic results of these gaps? It's obvious. As shown on this next slide, in Figure 5, C-suite executives just earn a lot more than the rest of the workforce, with a median income of $200,000 here in Northern Virginia, compared with $97,000 for non-managerial staff. Okay, so let's pause for a moment. That was a lot of numbers, but my personal takeaway from this American Community Survey data is simply this. Women and people of color together account for just 47% of executives, but constitute 74% of the Northern Virginia workforce. I just go back to that one fact, to that one sentence. Let's not lose the forest for the trees. We've got work to do. So it is now my pleasure to introduce Elizabeth Hughes, Senior Director of Insight Region, to share some early results from the data collection efforts that were conducted as part of the Champions for Accountability badging program. Elizabeth.
The data that Eileen presented provide an eye-opening look at our region as a whole, a region whose leaders do not fully represent the racial and gender diversity of our workforce. But anyone who's worked in data will know that some of these high-level statistics often fail to tell you about what's happening inside of each company. The Community Foundation and the Chamber wanted to know, what do these disparities look like at the employer level, and how are our region's companies responding, innovating, and working toward change? As Eileen mentioned, we created a badging system in close partnership with the Chamber of Commerce, the Champions for Accountability, to answer those questions. The badging system is designed to recognize employers that are willing to share their data on the composition of staff, C-suite, and board, and to provide honest responses about their efforts to make change. The system is also designed to encourage self-reflection and to spur action. I will leave it to my colleagues at the panel to talk more about what that action might look like. Today, I'll be sharing what we learned from the 53 employers who became champions. Before we talk about where these champions are in their DEI journey, I wanted to make a few notes. First, these champions provide a snapshot of what's going on in their individual companies, but are not meant to be representative of the entire region. So you'll see some background on the champions. They tend to have a more female and white workforce than the rest of Northern Virginia, and they are also predominantly in the nonprofit sector, and they are represented generally in 3 primary industries, which are, I can read it down here, professional and scientific services, religious grant-making, membership organizations, healthcare, and social services. And I say this all because we know that we are not going to have you be able to use their data to tell the story about all of Northern Virginia, but it does provide insight into how their workforce does or doesn't reflect leadership. Second, we recognize that while we are examining 2 attributes, race and gender, there are many other ways for companies to track, measure, and champion DEI beyond demographic representation, focusing on issues around inclusion, belonging, and equitable outcomes. And last, I wanted to pause to say thank you to the 53 champions who joined us on this journey and are committed to this work. I hope that your commitment will inspire others to participate and to take action on this. So here's what we learned. The average champion had a C-suite with a composition very similar to the numbers that Eileen shared. So 73% of the average champion's executive team was white, compared to 72% of executives throughout Northern Virginia, a very close approximation. But we do start to see other disparities emerge in the smaller groups in lighter yellow. So Black executives were actually relatively well represented compared to the rest of Northern Virginia's numbers, but we see pretty dramatic underrepresentation among Hispanic executives. So, for example, Hispanic workers make up 18% of Northern Virginia's labor force, but occupy just 3% of Champion's C-suites. When we examine gender composition, you can see that the executive team is actually very reflective of the overall workforce of Champions, which is good that there's pretty equal representation, but they don't reflect the overall demographics of Northern Virginia likely driven in part by the sectors and industries that they're clustered in. 61% of champions reported working to actively diversify their C-suite. This number was actually lower than we expected. The remaining 39% of those that were not actively pursuing this approach cited lack of vacancies, so there's just not a lot of room for diversification if they're not open positions, and also a belief that their C-suite was already diverse enough, which I hope that our panel can discuss later. Efforts to diversify staff, on the other hand, and create a pipeline to the C-suite were more common, with 74% of champions working toward that goal. Generally, champions talked about 3 stages of staffing that were important to this work: recruitment, selection, and advancement. It's interesting, and we talk about this in the report, that they had 2 pretty different approaches. So some champions talked about an increasing focus on standardization versus intentional targeting. So I'll take the second stage of candidate selection. One champion described an increasingly standardized process where common sets of questions and rating scales are used to assess each candidate fairly and to eliminate bias. Conversely, another champion focused on increased targeting of candidates with a selection process that included specific questions and processes to identify diverse candidates. And we talk about this a little bit more in the report and have a profile of how companies have actually been able to do both strategies concurrently with success. Next, we looked at efforts to diversify the board. Generally, champions had a board very closely aligned with the racial composition of their staff, albeit not the broader region. So the average champion had a 63% white board compared to a 59% white staff, and slightly less representation among Black and Hispanic board members. Compared to the Northern Virginia labor poll, there was pretty dramatic underrepresentation among Asian and Hispanic residents. When we looked at the gender composition of the board, we see that a board is generally in line with Northern Virginia's workforce, but substantially more male than the average Champions staff. So about half of Champions boards are male compared to 31% of their workforce, but similar to where we are as a region. About 3/4 of champions are actively working to diversify their boards, and while the specific approaches varied, we highlight 3 themes in the report. First, champions described a more nuanced view of diversity relative to their views for the C-suite. So moving beyond race and gender to look at how adding diversity of age, experience, justice involvement, socioeconomic status, and other attributes could help strengthen their board. They spoke about the importance of a fresh perspective and creating a board that represented the community that they serve. Second, they discussed ways to make it easier to serve on a board as a DEI strategy, including eliminating required give or get financial contributions and creating processes that carve out slots for representation from the community. Lastly, champions spoke about the importance of creating a culture of DEI on the existing board, recognizing the tremendous importance of this body of individuals in recruiting and selecting their replacements. What are the next steps for these 53 companies, along with the thousands of other employers in the region whose interests are piqued or who are already committed to this work? I'll now turn it over to Matt McQueen, Chief Communications and Engagement Officer with Peraton and Chair of the Northern Virginia Chamber of Commerce Board of Directors.
I find often we're starved for data, and I could sit here all day and listen to this because I think it's so critical that we now have a regional baseline. We've got to build, and I'm particularly pleased, my day job, with the long title that you saw there, that Peraton had an opportunity to participate in this. I think we've got plenty of room on the bus, and we need more. So please come and join us. It's really a great pleasure to be with you today and announce the 2022 Champions for Accountability digital badge holders. These companies have made a pledge, a commitment to advancing diversity within their own companies, and generously shared their internal data with our research team. This important research would not have been possible without their participation. Thank you. On the screen, you're going to see the 2022 Champions for Accountability. I'll give you a second to take a look at that illustrious and impressive list there. Well done. And as I said earlier, plenty of room on the bus. If your company's not already included on the list of champions, it's not too late. As Deb and Eileen mentioned earlier, the Champions for Accountability is an ongoing endeavor. You can opt in to share your data and earn your badge at any time. This important work is part of a larger strategy, and as I said earlier, forms the baseline, so this is just the beginning. I'd also like to encourage you to continue the conversation with us. In case you haven't heard, we've launched a new network called Dei Connects. The first event is next week, and our featured speaker is Juanita Wilson, the Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for JBG Smith, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, but you get an opportunity to see her next week. I hope you'll join us for that conversation and help us continue the dialogue. Okay, now putting my day job hat on again for a second. It's my pleasure to introduce our featured speaker and moderator, Dorothy Gilliam. So I kind of have as a communicator, kind of like starstruck here. It's fantastic to have you here and very, very excited to hear your comments. Dorothy is an original champion for accountability, a journalist, media diversity expert, and social justice advocate. And I would say living legend. She was the first African-American female reporter at the Washington Post in 1961. She left full-time journalism to raise her family and also did some freelance work. She returned to the Post as an assistant editor of the style section, clearly, and wrote a column for the Metro section from 1979 until her retirement in 2003. Dorothy has served as the president of the National Association of Black Journalists and created the Young Journalist Development Program to bring more young people into the world of journalism. The Washington Press Club awarded the Lifetime Achievement Award to Dorothy in 2010. She's the author of Trailblazer, a pioneering journalist fight to make the media look more like America, released in 2019. Please join me in welcoming Dorothy.
Thank you. I'll accept your hand to get
Yes,
up here.
absolutely.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I thank you so much for inviting me to share with you today. And I am looking forward to not making a few remarks myself, but also to the panel. They will be talking about many subjects that have been talked about already. This has been a very impressive report that I'm hearing. Very, very impressive about the progress you've made, about the challenges ahead. And I'm looking forward to, just spending time with you for the next few minutes. Now, as soon as I get my iPad to give me my talk, I will proceed. As it has already been said, I was the first African-American woman reporter at the Washington Post in 1961. And I have to say that it was tough at that time. It was very, very tough. The problems included, finding taxi cabs to pick me up as I stood outside the Post and frantically waved my hand because I had to go out and write my stories on deadline and then get back to the office to make certain that everything was correct. And of course, these were the days before all the technology that we have today. But it was a time when, I just faced prejudice both within and without the newsroom. One of the things I recall is that, some of the colleagues with whom I worked wouldn't speak to me when they saw me on the street. And that was very humiliating. Little things, big things. I won't, labor here long, but I still remember the black doorman at one of the swank apartment houses in Northwest Washington, who wouldn't let me in the front door. He said, "You have to go around the back door to the maid's entrance." Just so many things that happened, and when I think about that period, I can never forget the time in 1962 when I was sent by the Post to be part of a team that was covering the integration of the University of Mississippi. And the University of Mississippi was in Oxford, Mississippi, a relatively small town, but there were no hotels for me to stay. There were no hotels for blacks. White hotels would not let me in. And so I slept with the dead. I slept in a funeral home, a black funeral home. And, there are just so many things that come to mind when I briefly think about that period. But I am so pleased that things are better now. And we heard some of the ways they are better just today. But having, been through that period when things were so rough, it makes me doubly concerned on the one hand, but also pleased that progress has been made. And so I just salute all the people today who have been involved in these champions of accountability, the companies, et cetera, because it really, really is one of the most crucial things in America. But when I think about, my 33 years at the Washington Post, one of my chief objectives was diversity. And I was fortunate to have worked with 8 other diverse journalists, and we started a program called, we co-founded a program called the Institute for Journalism Education. And so we took action when we saw the fact that we didn't have enough minority journalists. And so our action was to start a program, and we ended up training hundreds of young people as black reporters or minority reporters, and eventually started also training white people as managers, because we knew that in order to really manage diversity, there was a need for special attention to certain factors. And so that was one of the things that we did many, many years ago. But when I think about where we are today, I wanted to look back a little bit at the time when I was active in the media many years ago, and then where we are today. And there's been a progression, because when I started at the Post, the civil rights movement was really just kicking into high gear. But the triumphs and the tragedies of that movement, it actually was one of the factors that launched the women's movement. Because I can remember Gloria Steinem, one of the leaders, one of the articles that she wrote was After Black Power, Women's Power. So there's been a progression of the progress that has been made. As some progress was made in terms of African Americans, progress was also made by women. But but there was also progress across the border, because when women began to gain more rights, white men also began to gain more rights. For example, family leave is something that everyone benefits from. And that's another one of the progression. And then we moved to a point where there was much more acceptance of the LBJQ community and the importance of that diversity. And then there was more openness and more acceptance of changing in attitudes of the disabled. So we've seen just a progression in this nation. And so when I said I'm so glad to be here, I'm glad to see the progression that we continue to make, and that was actually discussed with you already by many of the speakers. But what I'd like to focus on briefly before I bring up the panel members is also the fact that of where my business, the journalism business, is today, when it comes to issues of diversity, inclusion, belonging, equity. And there was a recent survey, and over 12,000 journalists, and many of them felt very, very concerned that they didn't feel that these factors of inclusion, etc., were being given the priority they needed in many areas of journalism. And they also were concerned that it also affects the quality of journalism, because if you don't have diversity on the staff, it's very hard to write about what you don't know. And so we need more diversity on the staffs in order to have the diversity that actually shows up in our news media, our radio, our television, newspapers, etc. So I have to say I am concerned that, for example, I would love to have seen several journalists here today, not for me, but for, I think, some of the reports that I've already heard. So I'm going to put on my to-do list to try to call somebody at the Post to say, maybe they're online, so maybe I shouldn't presume that is not happening. But I do think what we know about diversity is that, it's just so important. It is so crucial, and it's crucial in order to have, the kind of society that we all want, that we all desire. And I think these journalists who are critical of their own work, of their own profession rather, are really, really quite correct in saying that we need more diversity in order to have better products. And I think that could be expanded across the board. And I think, when we look at the business case for diversity, which I'm sure will be discussed later here today, it's very clear that diversity can also increase, profitability. It has so many positive effects, and that's what I think we know this nation needs at this point. So some of the figures that I heard about the lack of diversity in terms of race, the lack of diversity in terms of the challenge, I think will be part of the business case that will be made. So I think I will now move to bring forth the panelists who will be joining me here, and I'll be asking them questions. And I'll start by asking Stephanie Turner if she would please join us. Stephanie Turner is Vice President for Inclusion, Diversity, and Social Innovation for the MITRE Corporation. Dr. Nathan Carter is the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer for Northern Virginia Community College. And Layla, so I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Salguero is the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer for Peraton. So if they're all seated and ready, we will proceed with our questions. But I think before I take my seat, I will ask one question to each of you. And I'd like each of you please to answer it. How do you define diversity, inclusion, equity, belonging to your constituents today? How do you define it to them? And what does it really mean?
All right, good morning, everyone. It's good to see everyone here. I know we have people virtually too, so I'm appreciative of that. For me, I always like to keep things simple, and diversity to me is really all the ways that we're similar and different. We tend to focus on the differences, but we usually have more in common than we don't. So it is all those traits, those characteristics, those experiences that we each possess as a person, and then you can look at that also as a group. And so we tend to compare and contrast all day, and I always say diversity is a noun, it's a fact. You get to decide who you are when we talk about sharing our stories. And as I said, it's multidimensional. So we tend to focus on the primary dimensions in terms of when we were born, our gender, our race, our sexual orientation, our abilities. However, there's so much more to us than that. And the secondary dimensions are more around your hobbies, your interests, where you decide to go to school, who you date, your personality, your style. Those are all secondary. You have more choice in that as you grow and experience life. And then the third one is organizational dimensions of diversity. I've worked in 7 different industries. Some were union-based, some were not-for-profit, some were corporate Fortune 500 companies, some are multinationals, some are small. So that's another element of diversity that we don't think about, even within our own company. We work in different departments, different parts of the country. Some of us are individual contributors, some of us lead people. And then the last one is cultural. In terms of some of our cultural norms, I talk about a sense of space or time. I like to have space in between. If you're waiting in line, if you get too cramped up on me, I get uncomfortable. In other cultures, it's fine to be that close. Or a sense of time. My wife came from a military background, and so when she's with my family in Tennessee, and we go to a Southern Baptist church, it's 3 hours long, we may get there at 10:30, 11 o'clock, 12. It starts at 10 and goes to 1. To her, that's uncomfortable. She feels it's rude, and she'd rather be there really at 9:45. And so I say in my culture, it's okay. And so I like to say there's not a good or bad, right or wrong, it's just different. And so the more that we can expose ourselves to different cultures and people, you're going to feel more comfortable. You're going to know how to respond. I call it being culturally responsive. And you'll do things in a way that you're not going to feel uncomfortable or make a mistake because you've been exposed and you've been with people in your own network. And inclusion to me is a verb. It's an act. We know when we're being included or not. And so you first have to acknowledge people. You have to know that they're in the room, in your space. And a lot of times we just pass people. Eyes down, we're on our devices. We don't even do the eye contact. I came from a marketing background, and so even if you're busy, you can at least acknowledge someone's existence, nod, a lot of nonverbals. Once you do that, hopefully you tend to recognize and appreciate their skills, their characteristics, their traits, all those diversity elements. And the more that you do that, you build trust, and you know how to leverage their skills where they feel valued and where they can contribute their full potential. So it's a noun plus a verb, and what we do at MITRE is say we yield belonging. So the more that we do that inclusive behaviors and practices, the more people are going to have a sense of belonging, and they're going to stay. And so the bottom line to me is retention. We work hard at recruiting and attracting talent. The harder part is keeping them. Do they have a sense of belonging? What are those daily interactions that you have with people where people feel like, yes, this is a place for me. I feel valued, recognized, appreciated. I'm utilizing all my skills. People are listening to me. And so that's the day-to-day grind, the work. Some days you go backwards, some days you go forward, but over time you hope to have progress. So that's how I would define all of those. And to me, equity is just the process. We have to look at where we have systemic inequities. And looking at our policies, even though we may have good intention, the impact may be negative. And so taking the time to do the deep dive, get to the root cause analysis, do the quantitative and qualitative research to figure out where can we have some interventions and make some adjustments and customize the tools and resources based on the individual, not what was good for you or for the company. And that takes time to truly get to equity, and that final outcome is equality. We'll all feel that we're equal, but the way we got there is going to be different based on all of the dimensions of diversity that we have. So, long answer, but.
No, interesting answer.
I really appreciate the question, because part of this work that we're talking about is making sure that you have clear communication about what these terms really mean, because we know that they're important, but what they stand for will really depend on the way that your institution defines diversity, equity, and inclusion and weaves it into the organization. At NOVA, we use the term inclusive excellence as our strategic plan to define these important terms: diversity, equity, inclusion, belongingness. But to answer the question, I often say, diversity is a choice. Our diversity is a fact, really. I mean, we can look at data and we can identify its presence or its absence. So diversity is a fact. It's about all those different things, all those different lived experiences, all those different demographic characteristics. As an educator, sometimes I like to use metaphors too. So sometimes when I'm talking to students and others about diversity, I kind of use that standard discussion or analogy about diversity being a dance. And you can be in a space and look around at the party or at the dance and notice if there's diversity there or is there not. So that's a fact, right? Equity then, right? Equity is more about fairness, as we've heard. But how do you get to that fairness? It's a choice that you can make. An organization, a company, NOVA, they're the choices that we make that align with fairness. Right? So equity is about the work that you do to try to create fairness. And in that same analogy, I often will talk to students and others about, okay, well, if the diversity is looking around to see if everyone's at the dance, equity is about, can everybody get to the dance? Right? Does everybody have a way to get to the dance to join the party, right? And as someone throwing the party or an organization with some control, you can look at your own policies and practices and procedures and identify whether or not you're creating barriers to fairness or barriers that allow people to succeed and participate, or if you're creating lanes of opportunity, right? So equity is about fairness, but it's a choice that you can make. There are things that you can do to enhance equity. And then we get to the inclusion, right, and the belongingness. And just as my colleague noted, that's a feeling, right? Individuals will either feel welcomed, feel included in the work that you're doing, or perhaps they will not. And so that's important, right? Recognizing that this work is about people's feelings, their emotions, and the things that you need to do to create that authentic feeling of belongingness. So in that same analogy, I'll talk to students and others about the dance, and you can look around and ask yourself, factually speaking, is there diversity or not? You can look inward and be self-reflective and say, are we aligning ourselves with equity? Are we creating opportunities for people to come to this party? But the inclusion and the belonging is then that individual comfortableness that everyone feels that they can dance, right? Like, and we all have different ways of dancing, don't we? Right? We have different dances that we do, different things that maybe we're comfortable to dance in front of you. I would, all these kinds of things, right? But whether or not people want to dance and be there is about the feelings of belongingness that they have. And if they feel included and they feel like they belong, then they're more likely to participate in the opportunity that's afforded to them by being there. The opportunity that you helped to create because you thought about equity. And those are the ways that you sustain the diversity, right? So we talk about inclusive excellence, but you've got to have different tools in your toolbox to discuss these important concepts because it will all depend on the audience that you're speaking to. So having that DEI plan that maps that out is really important. That's the way we try to do it at NOVA, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So for me, the diversity, I agree with everything that you all mentioned, and we all come with our lived experiences, right? I was just thinking, Stephanie, as you were talking growing up, I would translate for my mom because, she doesn't speak English very well. And so, and that was always fun, especially when it was a school report and I had to translate my own nonconformance to something. But that's the thing that we also try to do at Peraton. It's do the can't be done. And what we've done from a diversity and inclusion perspective is, together we do the can't be done because that's what we really want to strive for is the inclusion piece. We've all talked about the definitions of equity. There's like really nice, information that was shared with us today. But the bottom line is that is what we have to focus on is yes, the numbers are important, but it's a factor. We know that we have to do better. It's how can we make sure that people from various backgrounds, from various lived experiences, regardless of what that is, whether it's rural, whether it's here, it's, like somebody mentioned what schools they went to, are we providing those opportunities so that from an inclusion perspective, people feel included and valued? Because I think you're absolutely right, Stephanie. It's about retention. We want to make sure that we spend so much time bringing the best and brightest to our organizations. We want to make sure that we keep them motivated, keep them engaged. And part of that is by focusing on, making sure that our employees feel included. So it's listening, it's putting processes and procedures in place, but at the same time, it's also then implementing what we're listening for. Are we listening to the right things and activities? So,
am I also hearing that it's about really recognizing the worth of each human being? That it's really about humanity, and so part of it was when you have certain segments of the society who don't have that attitude toward others. Does that not make your work much more challenging?
Oh, yes. There are challenges in the work, but it's looking for those opportunities for common ground. I think there's things that we can all agree on. We can talk about how when we have diverse perspectives in the room, we know that the results that we get from that are much better. Marketably better. We can point to research about that. Mm-hmm. We can talk about the importance of progress and innovation. Sometimes I'll talk about how diversity, equity, and inclusion, they really can be the currency of innovation and progress. And who doesn't want for innovation and progress, right? And it can be challenging, yes, but the work is always about trying to find where we're more alike than we are dissimilar. And some places where we're alike revolve around what are the goals here for our organization, for our institution, for progress, for innovation. And those are places to begin.
But what does real commitment to diversity look like, just very briefly, within your institutions? Real commitment to it look like?
I think part of it is the investment in it, right? So I think all of us have teams that focus on it, on our diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts specifically, because that's our function, that's our role. But it takes more than those of us up here. We really have to have the buy-in from the leaders, from the managers that are making the hiring decisions, that are making those decisions. So it's providing those opportunities to ensure that they have an understanding of the importance of it. There's so much information. out there. Like there's McKinsey studies, there's all of these studies. We know how important it is to value and inclusion efforts within the organizations. And so I think part of that is just making sure that those opportunities are there. So funding is part of it. And then making sure that there's follow through on the commitments that have been made.
To me, it's more than lip service. So we all want to have larger teams, more money. I have my senior manager here in the room, and just comparing my team as an officer to others, is it equal? No. Could we have a lot more equity there? Yes. I also think it's looking at the board. I know every time I'm recruited for a role, it's one of the first things I do. Let's see what their board looks like. Do they even share their photos? Do we know what their composition looks like? So that was one thing I was impressed about MITRE, as well as the internal senior officer corps. It's looking at how do we communicate? How do we market and brand ourselves? Is it authentic? Or is it coming from the lens of the audience they're trying to reach? It's also looking at the reporting structure for all of us. You know, do we report into the CEO? Do we report into HR? Is another component of that as well. And are you seeing progress in terms of the overall workforce as well as the senior leaders? We look at all of that. We even look at our intern composition. We've added LGBTQ plus since I've been here. We look at our veteran status. We look at generational. We look at geographic. And so how much is shared and communicated publicly is another key thing too that I'm always pushing us to do more of too. If we don't see it or know about it, then there's really much we cannot do about it. And so the more that you can monitor and track, it's visible. You know, we have a corporate annual measure that's part of our expanded pay for senior leaders. So how are you integrating I&D concepts into every component or piece of the business is really the ultimate goal, because it should be about everything that we do, honestly.
You absolutely have to ask yourself if you value diversity, then you have that commitment at senior levels of leadership. And that's really important, and where that reporting line is part of that. And as you've heard, it's the resources, right? Across various levels of employee statuses, right? How are you investing in making that a priority? Are you making that known to your internal and external stakeholders that you not just value on an aspirational level, diversity, equity, and inclusion, but that you can see the progress that needs to be made? Are you setting measurable goals around progress? And are those measurable goals and your ascension towards them, are you public about that? Sometimes that's a sobering conversation to have internally and externally, but in having it, you are showing that true commitment and doing the difficult things. And that makes a world of difference, because it lets everyone know, externally and internally, that not only do you value diversity, but you are being honest about the work that's left to do, and you're being critically self-reflective about your involvement in making progress around inclusive excellence, as we say at NOVA, or diversity, equity, and inclusion and belongingness.
But if the most challenging area for diversity is the executive level, which is not very diverse, how do you deal with that? Do you deal with it by making the business case for diversity, or how do you all handle that issue?
For me, it's kind of like what Nathan says, you have to have those honest conversations. And so I think part of our role is ruffling the feathers, asking the questions that no one else is willing to ask, and to speak the truth. And so that's one thing I've been doing is like, I've noticed that we don't have any Latino officers, or we don't have black male officers. And so recently we have hired our first black male officer, but someone has to be the person in the room, and then to continue to have the conversation. Similar to what you say, is defining what does it mean for us. And I don't want it just to be we look at people's skin color, or we think we know their gender, and we're like, check the box, we've done it. And so again, it's getting back to that multidimensional definition of diversity. Sometimes you can't see it. I think if you have more than one human being, you're automatically going to have some type of diversity, whether it's in that secondary, the organizational, cultural. And so it's trying your best whenever you have an opportunity is to ensure that you are thinking about what's not being represented, what type of experience or background do we need to make this a better place for all of us. I know I do that on my team. I look for people who have experience and background in areas that I'm not good in or don't have. How many of us are really doing that, or are we hiring what I call a mini-me? I just want more mini-me's of Stephanie Turner.
Yeah.
I don't want that. I've tried it in my dating life. That didn't work either. So, where you have weaknesses, where can you find someone that has that strength? And hopefully getting the trust, and that takes time to share and be vulnerable. We tend to have what we call an expert culture, but we can't know everything. And this is an area when we talk about humanity and people that most of us don't have a lot of experience there, and be willing to have those critical conversations on what we need to do. Listening to your people is critical, that active listening. Not to be right, but to have clarity and understand really what do we need and how can we get there. Know that it takes time. Celebrate when you have those milestones, but know this is a lifelong journey. We're not going to get through overnight. You've been doing this for a while. My parents, it's going to continue after we're not here either. And it should be treated like any other business function. We never say, when are we going to be finished with marketing? When are we going to be finished with communications? But we always get that question, when are we going to get there with I&D? In my opinion, we're never going to get there because it's always going to be changing based on the dynamics of people and what's going on in the world.
Yeah, and I'll just echo that because I think that even for me personally in the role, there's a lot of impatience, right? And change is not going to happen as fast as we want it to, but it is that partnership. I think that's what was really important because I know we all have either from small or large organizations, but we, like I mentioned earlier, we can't do it alone. So it's a matter of, for example, our talent management, partnering to ensure that when succession planning templates and procedures are being developed, that our voice is also a part of that to ensure that they're taking a look at talent differently, so that we don't have. We would love many Stephanies, but so that we're expanding beyond and beyond that view. And I don't think. Sometimes it doesn't have to be too complicated either. So for example, now we're taking a look at our performance reviews. Well, what kind of questions can we ask so that everyone is accountable for inclusion efforts, not just, the few. So those are some of the things that I think are really important that, some may be just very tactical, but very powerful in terms of moving this ahead. Because you're right, we're never going to be done. Unfortunately.
Okay, but what is the business case for this work?
Well, I think, like I was mentioning before, there is proven information, even the information that we saw here, right? That companies that value diversity, that have placed an importance of diversity, are more profitable. So that alone, right? We have a business in order to make money. If you embrace diversity, equity, and inclusion, your business will make more money, your employees will stay. So I think that's part of it, and providing that information in a way that, again, I think you just have to keep repeating it. And I think even some organizations, that already know the value of it, it's that reminder of the actions that we actually have to take, so that I think, you mentioned it, it's not just lip service, but we're actually doing something about it. We know it's important. Organizations know it's important, especially in this Northern Virginia area, right? There is a well awareness of how important it is. And it's, for me, the conversations that we've had just within this group too, Elizabeth and Jennifer just providing us with the opportunity to get a heads up about this information. It's front of mind. So I think that's the other thing, is we always have to keep that reminder that it is important, even though, again, many of us are sitting here because we know what the importance is, in making sure from that business perspective we're providing that value as well.
Yeah, at Nova, and like all companies, I really do feel like data is your best advocate here. But there's a certain way that you've got to show the data to make the business case, you have to disaggregate your data in different ways. And as you do that, lots of lessons are uncovered. At Nova, we learned a lot of lessons and a lot of implications of the pandemic. For example, the impact on the socioeconomic conditions here in Northern Virginia, specifically for certain communities that are struggling for education and struggling for career and struggling for jobs. So what did we do? I mean, we did a deep dive into that data to make the business case of like, look at the role of our institution that it can have on helping solve problems here in this region. If you look at the impact of the pandemic on our Hispanic, Latino communities, on our African American communities, on our veteran communities, we can see that there's a real need. I mean, these are real world problems that we're all facing together. But by looking at the impact of these problems on various communities and disaggregating that data, you can be inspired, empowered to realize that there's a role that my institution can play in trying to address these societal concerns. But you have to be willing to dedicate the time and resources to looking at that data and then, yes, having the honest conversations about that. But to make that a priority would mean that your institution has dedicated resources, whether you have a diversity officer or not. There are other things that you can do to make sure that that information is there. We also would say you have to partner, right? Like at Nova, we're trying to do a lot of partnerships in the community. We're trying to do a lot of partnerships with our private sector partners or businesses around this common need to solve these social problems. We have a marvelous business engagement center at Nova now working on guaranteed interview programs for our students. But data is your friend, is the short answer here, right? If we track the way that society is changing on a demographic level, if we look at that data, you can't ignore that the future of this region will rely on a variety of different communities and lived experiences. To ignore that is to ignore the future of work in this region, and you can't do that. So, I mean, that's the business case that you make, but I often will make it with data because it's hard to question the data when it's in front of you.
To me, it's just retention. We talked about that earlier. We all need people. And so what are you going to do to take care of your people? And this is why engagement and sense of belonging is brought up a lot too. Do you want to be around for the next 20, 100 years? You can't do that if you don't take care of your people, if you're not aware of what's going on globally, the implications. How do you treat them where they want to be there? They want to work and give their all. I work for companies where they got really arrogant, and you just saw, employees leave and go down. You may get lawsuits. You don't want that. You want to have a great reputation. You want to be known for being a phenomenal organization that's really contributing to things that are relevant in the world, such as us, solving problems for a safer world. You need people. You need people from different backgrounds, from different parts of the world. We're all competing for the same talent. Doesn't matter if it's for a Fortune 500, whether they're based in another country, and they can leave, they can go with their feet. And so that's what you're looking at. And what can you do while they're here to ensure that you're doing all that you can? Whether it's looking at their benefits, whether it's looking at, how can they grow in their career? Maybe they want to get another degree. Maybe they want to volunteer and do more in the community. What can you do based on what you stated to ensure that they're going to be here and attract more talent? So that's the goal. You want high morale. For us, we're a not-for-profit, so money isn't the thing that we look at. But we do need that talent, and that's human beings.
We've talked a lot about, all the aspects of this, but I wanted to go back just briefly to the belonging and to ask, how can business leaders really create a culture of belonging?
So one of the things that we are really doing, and most organizations, the large organizations have like the employee resource groups, right? So, there's, I'll just give the one example. this year participated, as did many organizations, in the Pride Parade in DC. And that's one of the things that we have a Pride Alliance ERG. But it really, again, I think it demonstrates that when we listen to, something that the Pride Alliance ERG was very interested in. Again, there was investment behind it, but it was also the sense of belonging and community, bringing that the team together and then participating, seeing our senior leaders participate in that. So I think it shows that there is importance to ensure our employees feel that they belong with our organization. And that's just one example of really creating that opportunity. Right now we are looking at our engagement survey results and taking a look at how we can ensure that people feel engaged. So I think that's the other thing. If you're going out and putting surveys out there, then you really have to act on them and take that action and next step. Because it is about engagement and belonging. I think you're absolutely right. It's about retaining our employees, and if they feel that they belong into the organization, that's one way to do that.
Yeah, it's the visibility of different lived experiences, different diversity of thought, different points of view, and where you see opportunities to enhance that, right? To enhance the visibility of that. Absolutely, you have to ask your folks, right? Like, what does belonging mean to them? Mm-hmm. And we can't assume, right? I mean, if we look at some of the results from this great effort, something that should come from that is that awareness that we may not know, right? Like what belonging really means to this diverse employee group that we have, right? So what mechanisms are we taking to ask that question about, what could we do here at this institution to encourage one to feel like they're welcomed here? At NOVA, we talked about that. We have different diversity, equity, and inclusion campus committees, as well as the Office of DEI, and we set aside time to have conversations to assess what are some of the things that we could do. Is it about the different ways that we can make sure that on our campuses we have lactation spaces for our parenting employees and students? Is it about making sure that we have appropriate wayfinding so that individuals that need to use gender-neutral bathrooms, single occupancy restrooms, that they know where to go? A lot of it was about the wayfinding. They're like, if I'll feel more like I belong if I understand where the resources that are here. I think it's great that as an institution, someone told me that NOVA's doing all of these great things to provide resources, but I didn't know that you were doing those things, and I didn't know where I could find them. So the wayfinding towards the resources is an important piece, and I think that's something very specific that every organization, company can look at and ask yourself, okay, we're doing some things, but how are we allowing our employees and our folks to find their ways to those opportunities? Do they stumble upon them on happenstance? Do they happen to bump into somebody in the break room that tells them about the affinity group? Or when we're onboarding individuals, do we actually create opportunities for them to find the resources that we've already invested in? And that's an important thing that can be thought about what can you do to encourage belonging? How do you wayfind for your teams to find those opportunities?
And at Minor, sense of belonging is one of our employee engagement statements on there. So we really do monitor it. We do it 3 times a year. We put together a belonging framework that has 4 components so our leaders can have that conversation with their employees. One is around accountability, one is around expectations of their role, one is around trust as well. And so figuring out, again, what does it mean to them and how can the leader help them with that? We just finished our inaugural Week of Belonging that my I&D team put together at the end of August. And it was virtual as well as on our 2 main campuses here in McLean and in Bedford. We got our business resource groups involved. We had external speakers come in. We even had our board. So again, Hiba and my team put it on the dates where we had our board meet. And we even had them do the closing piano. We kicked it off with our CEO and myself on talking about belonging and inclusion. So throughout that week, there were so many things that employees could do where they were available, whether it was virtual for all of our employees across the country, as well as in person. We had T-shirts. We had really like a festival where people could stop, sign up, be a member. We had prizes and giveaways, but it really uplifted the morale of our employees here. And so we're constantly trying to do things to ensure that we're trying to be as inclusive as possible.
What I'm hearing from you, Stephanie, is the importance of intentionality in so much of this. Is there anything else you want to say about that?
Yeah, I share this a lot with my peers and colleagues. We'll hear things like, oh, we need more diversity. That doesn't tell me anything based on our definition for diversity. So I said, be very specific, be intentional. Do you mean you need more women? Are you looking for more black people, people of color? Say it. And so be more specific and precise and direct on what you really mean, because to us, diversity is such a broad definition. It means so many things. And so, again, with our initiatives, how does it align to what we call our good growth strategy? Again, you have to be intentional. You have to be visible in terms of what are you doing, putting together annual reports, sharing stuff on our internal intranet site. My team has done a phenomenal job working with Tracy and her team and others on what do we have on our website that just got launched, MITRE.org. What are we doing internally so our employees know what's going on? And so we have monitors all across our campuses when you're waiting to get on the elevator. Again, I come from a marketing background. We have to promote what we do and brand it and then recognize what we're doing. So we are very intentional about everything, very strategic. Again, it does support the business, and you want your businesses to be involved too. They invite us to town halls, leadership offsites. We are doing a lot of inclusive leadership workshops, helping them with their skills and capability, and really reinforcing our definitions of what we mean when we say inclusion, diversity, belonging, and now equity.
I guess I'd like to also ask a specific question to Nathan. What is the role of higher education in, really pushing this diversity to become a reality? It's an interesting subject to talk about, but how do we move from, looking at what you all are doing to really making some of these things a reality?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I know I'll say, Dr. Kress and we'll talk about, we really view Nova as the greatest provider of talent in this region. I mean, we have over 60,000 students, right? And we've been fortunate to see a growth in enrollment. That's important. Even in light of the pandemic, we're doing well. But higher education has a critical role to play. I mean, we are creating the talent that will be in the private sector and year after year after year. So the way in which higher education positions itself with diversity, equity, and inclusion, with inclusive excellence, the way that we provide opportunities for our students from diverse backgrounds to understand the lanes of opportunity is going to be so impactful to their ability to engage in this global workforce afterwards. So if Nova in higher education is not valuing DEI, if our leadership structure is not diverse, if we don't have DEI strategic plans, that plants a message in young students. I mean, we have a strong dual enrollment program. We partner with the local school divisions here. The work that we do around DEI sets the stage and starts a thinking for young students to recognize what's possible and how they can achieve all of their dreams, whatever they are, educational or career-wise. So education has a critical role to play in starting the conversation early and often that these things are possible no matter your background or lived experience. But we have to do more than just say it's possible. We've got to show that it's possible by the work that we're doing around inclusive excellence. And I know a lot of my higher ed colleagues agree with that. And we're just going to continue to do that important work for this region and for all students that come to Nova.
Now, you talked about having direct affiliations with different schools in the area. Do you make sure that some of these are with black schools and Latino schools and Asian schools? Do you really try to go down deep and touch students who may not have any concept of these possibilities.
Absolutely. I mean, we're, as a community college, as a state institution, our doors are open to all students, no matter their background and lived experience. But as part of our DEI work, I mean, we do look for these partnerships. Right now, Nova has a grant partnership that we've worked on with Dominion Energy and the Hispanic Association of Colleges and Universities. That's specifically about identifying the local high schools and school divisions where there's a larger population of students that self-identify as Hispanic, but also might be dealing with socioeconomic challenges, and thinking about how can we show them opportunities to have strong starts at Nova and enter career pathways that we know are going to lead to those high-demand, high-wage career jobs. So yes, we have to be specific and intentional in a lot of different programs, and that's that equity work, right? I mean, the equity is about thinking about what specific additional programs do we need to create so that everyone has a fair chance at opportunity. Equity is not equality. Different people need different things to succeed based on a whole variety of history that's present in society, right? And so Nova is a public institution. We're for all students, no matter their background, demographic situations, their political affiliations. Nova is for all students and everyone. But we still will do equity work and think about how can we do this work in a way that creates lanes of opportunity for everyone. And that's something that we are working to do.
Okay. Well, let's close, I think, with a question for everyone, the same question for everyone. And that question is, where will we be in the next 10 years from now in this whole area of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging?
Okay.
I'm going to let you take that one.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we're making progress, but I think the data that we saw today shows that we have a ways to go. So I think it's what Nathan was just talking about, and partnering with universities, with elementary schools, with higher education, and partnering with each other as a community of businesses, so that we can make a stronger impact. And in 10 years, the numbers will look way better than they look now. Realistically, I don't think it's going to happen overnight, but I do think that we are seeing progress, and things like events like this, awareness building like this, I think helps us move towards the right direction.
Yeah, I feel like we'll be right where we are. I've been doing this for over 25 years, and
wow,
the
that's
issues
not a very optimistic perspective.
I'm realistic, and I was
So
idealistic.
when you say that, you mean you don't think you will have accomplished any changes right here in MITRE?
Oh, at MITRE, yeah. I'm thinking globally.
I hear you.
Yeah. That is my goal while I'm here. This is hopefully my last stint before I retire, and I do want to leave a legacy and have a true impact on the work. It does rely on those to continue to do it. I've worked at companies that we're doing a phenomenal job, but once that CEO leaves or that senior leader leaves, it goes right back down to zero, and you got to start all over. So this is, again, why I say the work never ends. You can't just rest on your laurels, check the box. It is day-to-day work all of the time. And so as long as you are intentional and you have that visibility, you'll be there. I'm hoping in this 10 years that I will have, based on your timeline, we're really trying to look at that K through 12 pipeline of talent. We know there's a huge deficit on the demand versus the supply. And as long as I've been living, or my parents' life too, the standardized testing scores for 4th grade and 8th grade between black children and white children is the largest on their math, science, and reading. And so at MITRE, we're always trying to think big. What can we do that no one else is really doing? And so we're working on a project with some HBCUs. I'm a product of one too, so I always will make sure that we are partnering with our MSIs and HBCUs, but focusing on a county where there's a large population of black students working with startups, academia, and also for-profit on what can we do to revamp the curriculum so it gets back to equity and start all over with the teachers, the parents, the children, the school superintendent, retool, reteach on what is needed for them to do well. And so by the time they get to high school, college age, they're going to still want to be interested in STEM. Maybe they come work for MITRE or somewhere else. But we're really trying to positively have generational impact. How can we, in the next 10, 20 years, ensure that our students of color, our families of color, are doing well? And if they go into a STEM field, they can do financially well, and success will be there for their children and so on. So that is really my big goal to do.
Thank you.
I think that we have work to do, and hopefully in 10 years when we see a slide like Champions of Accountability, we can use the whole 2 hours to go through the slide and find all the different companies in this region that are making a commitment to doing the work, and knowing that after you get the badge, there's so much more work to do. But I'm hopefully optimistic. I'm reminded of Maya Angelou when she says, you do the best that you can with what you know, and then when you know better, you do better. And one of the things that I can tell you...
Do you think that people in the executive suites who don't, do you think they've ever heard that statement by Maya Angelou?
I'm not sure. I'm in the higher ed world, so I can't speak for what C-suite folks know, but
Stephanie said no, they've never heard that.
I've heard it.
Yeah, Maya Angelou is amazing, and that's some really powerful words about when you know better, you do better. And if the pandemic has taught us anything, and we often call it a dual pandemic, do we not? Right? Because of some of the racial awakening in our country. But we all know better now, I would say. This is a testament to the reality that across public and private sectors, that we do know better. So what's left is doing the better. I want to believe optimistically that everyone in this room and those watching the virtual webinar here, that you all are committed to doing better in the same way that we are. And as long as we work together and we recognize that there are these common grounds, and rather than being all different from one another, we can rally around a common goal to solve real-world problems, I'd like to think in 10 years we'll be a little bit better. Not a lot better, a little bit better, day by day. These problems, they've existed for hundreds of years. They're not going to go away in 10 years, but we can make it better. So I try to be optimistic while also being realistic about the time it's going to take to get us on the right path.
I'm sorry.
I thought I answered it.
Oh.
Yes. You can.
Well, I think our panel, do we have time for any questions from the audience, Tracy?
No, we do not.
Thank you, everybody. I love the thoughtfulness of that discussion. Themes around diversity is good for the economy. Of course it is. The economic case for inclusivity is in. Nathan's comments around authentic feelings of belongingness. People have to feel like they belong before they want to come to the dance. And Layla speaking about bringing your whole person, your voice, speaking up, being intentional. And Dorothy bringing us back time and time again to belonging and trust. Trust and belonging, these two atavistic needs that every single human being have. And it makes me think and ask the question, how can we as individuals and our entire community enhance a sense of belonging and trust here in our community here in Northern Virginia? So I just love the discussion. Thank you, Dorothy Gillen, Stephen Turner, Nathan Carter, Layla Salguaro. And also, thank you, panelists, for helping guide the data on the report and in this whole Champions for Accountability initiative. It was critical work, and we needed your voice, and we really, really appreciated it. So on behalf of Julie Coons, who very much wanted to be here today, she's the president and CEO of the Chamber. On behalf of the Community Foundation, Thank you so much. Thank you to MITRE for an unbelievable venue here, beautiful, and the support for this event and for this topic. We're very, very grateful. As you heard Matt say, if anyone is here from a company or at home who's listening in that hasn't yet participated in the Champions for Accountability process and wants to, the process, I believe, remains open. So we're hoping that, I'm sorry? There'll be an email today that will give you all instructions on how you can become a champion as well. I hope you all enjoy your day. I hope you're all inspired by this conversation. Thank you so much for coming.